physical threats to the bulk power system. The Commission would have a mechanism to engage industry, propose a directive, engage industry, and get a directive established to mitigate either a physical or a cyber threat. The process under 215 by law is open, and so if a standard were to be developed, it would have to be developed in an open forum. So not only the vulnerability or the threat would have to be disclosed, but then the proposed mitigation. It's not necessarily timely because it is a very inclusive process that gets everyone to participate, and it's not necessarily responsive because the Commission can't author a standard. It can't direct a specific measure. It can make a directive to a specific mitigation, but it has no control over what might come back from industry. So in that context, it's wholly insufficient to assure that a vulnerability or a threat, either physical or cyber, has been addressed.
Yes, ma'am. From the standpoint of the department, we look at all the pending legislation, and we look at the opportunities to identify the best method to move forward. Of key concern from our standpoint is I go back to some of my previous experience as an arms control inspector under the START Treaty and INF Treaty. We were directed to trust but verify, and there lies the key. I can issue a directive, but unless I have the ability to follow up and determine whether those actions were taken, I have no firm understanding whether or not the threat has been or the risk has been mitigated. So subsequently, language that addresses that opportunity for whatever appropriate agency will take those necessary steps feel is vital to continuing the mission.
And I'm going to yield back the balance of my time and now recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentleman from California, Mr. Lungren, for his questions.
Thank you very much. I'd address this to all of you. We talk about the smart grid. In some ways, it reminds me of some of the issues we had when we went to online banking. It's only going to be utilized by people. People are only going to have confidence in it if they feel that it's secure. Are we doing what we need to do to make sure as we develop the smart grid proposals at various levels to build security into it?
Within the funding opportunity announcement, the Department of Energy did put very strict requirements for proposers to document and look at the cybersecurity aspects, and they will have to include that in the proposals. So we feel very comfortable with the language put in there that any proposers are going to have to address some of the elements that I've mentioned in my testimony as part of their smart grid projects.
Well, let me put it another way. For other kind of enterprises, we have insurers who assess risk and make insurance rates based on that risk. And obviously, to mitigate those rates, you do certain things. There are sometimes tax incentives. There are a whole host of things. Is regulation the only and most effective way we can make sure that security is built into the smart grid, or do we need to look at some of these other mechanisms as well?
If I may start, security is a service, and it's a process that has to be included within the utility or within the smart grid infrastructure. So it is a service that must be maintained, just like we have service on our computers. And so it is a way that it should be developed within the electric industry so that there is companies such as the ones you've heard of in the first panel to provide this service to the industry as well as to the customers.
Is there something we need to do to make sure that the rate structure allows for this?
Within the smart grid technologies, we're within specific aspects of utility infrastructure. The rate structures can be used to support that. For national security events, which is a public good, there's probably maybe other mechanisms that could be investigated.
Well, let me ask you this, Mr. McClelland. This goes to the question of EMP. We've heard low probability, high consequence. I'd say the highest consequence, yes. Almost. How do we ensure, or how do we provide incentives that the private sector and let's just concentrate on the private sector will take seriously these sorts of things? And what I mean by that is this. If you're going to go to your, whatever authority it is you have to go to for your rates, rate approval, and they say, well, to justify your rates, you have to show us that there is a reasonableness to what you are doing and what you want to charge for. And they go in there and they say, well, low probability, high consequence. Does a rate-making organization, authority in a state or even a regional area understand that? And do we need the focus of the federal government to actually have us take it seriously? The reason I say that is I just don't think we're taking this seriously enough. When you hear the testimony of the consequences, I mean, it makes Katrina look like a day in the park.
Yes.
And yet, after Katrina, we said, oh my God, we'll never let that happen again. We've got to be more focused on it. We'll put billions of dollars in to make sure that that kind of thing doesn't occur. Yet I don't sense that in terms of EMP. You seem to take EMP seriously.
Yes.
You seem to accept the argument that it could have devastating consequence.
Yes.
But yet it does not appear to me that we either in the Congress or the executive branch have taken it seriously enough to make it the kind of priority that I would have. And so I guess I would ask you, what do we need to do so that the range of costs that we've seen, the EMP Commission said that the range of costs to protect critical infrastructure components would range, it could be from $150 million to $9 billion. That's a lot of change. Do you believe Congress should provide cost recovery to utilities to cover these expenses through reimbursement by the ratepayers? Is that reasonable? Is it something that Congress needs to do in terms of subsidies, tax incentive? I mean, what do we need to do to make this happen?
I'd like to begin by, I'll jump back just for a second to your prior question about smart grid. Last week, the Commission issued a policy statement under EISA. It's the Commission's responsibility after NIST develops the standards to codify the standards, to put the standards into place, to set the standards in order that interoperability is established. One of the key elements in the policy statement last week was that the Commission would provide rate recovery. It would even consider stranded costs for an entity that began to install smart grid equipment, but then the equipment was obsolete, turned out to be obsolete, if the entity built in cybersecurity. That was one of the 4 elements. And so there's a cost recovery mechanism. The same application can and should be applied to EMP. It's unrealistic to think that entities, that utilities, will move forward on EMP mitigation measures in the context of high risk, low probability. And if I just might say something about that, on the last panel there were 2 different witnesses. I won't say who they are, but it was very telling. One witness classified it as high risk, low probability. A second witness, however, said high risk, low frequency. There's a very big difference there. Mm-hmm. Probability is not an assessment, and I think you heard that very clearly, that without intelligence, without information, it's not an assessment that an entity or a person is qualified to make. That should be left to the folks that deal with intelligence. And so high risk, low frequency is a better way to classify it, coupled with a rate recovery mechanism. And on the very end, I mean, partnership is great, and we all hope that partnership works. But in the absence of a regulatory mechanism, it's to Mr. McGurk's point about trust but verify, in the absence of some regulatory mechanism to force an entity to take action, some entities just simply will not take action. Regulation is there for the entities that won't take action. And so I really believe a personal perspective on this, and I was in the electric utility industry for 20 years before I came to government for the past 5. And we knew about EMP, we knew about EMP mitigation measures. I saw a declassified report that showed very specific attack vector, and we were asked to evaluate that. I was asked to as a controls and relays engineer, and we did our job. But the chance that industry would move forward if it considers it to be a low probability event with everything else that's happening is really not realistic.
Thank you.
I now recognize Ms. Richardson of California, a member of the subcommittee, for her questions at this time.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Mr. McGurk, as you saw, I introduced you to one of the witnesses who seemed to have made some attempts to reach out to the department, but had not been successful. How long have you been in your position? Could you turn your microphone on?
Pardon me, Congresswoman. I joined the department in January of 2008, In September of 2008, I participated in a brief hosted